Well, yesterday, of course, was the 4th of July. And as I was thinking about this lesson, we're going to continue in our series on biblical identity. But we have one of these core values up here of relevancy. And I thought, how often do you have the opportunity to teach a lesson on the 250th anniversary of your country? And I thought maybe, just maybe, I should try to connect today's lesson with that, which is what I did. I did do that. So last night, as the fireworks were going off on the television, I was saying, how do I blend this lesson into just the historical context of this particular weekend? So with this, you need to know that this will be the one-off of all one-off lessons. I will not be able to teach this lesson again. I will not have this context to teach this lesson again. When I get to the end of teaching biblical identity, it is possible that I will, at some point down the line, teach biblical identity again, at which point there will be some variation of this lesson, but there will not be this lesson. So with that, I think we should start with a history lesson. Let's start with a history lesson today. So just as an aside, I was in the Sunday school supply room, and they have this box of dry erase markers, and I thought, my marker's getting a little weak. I went and I dug into that box, and they had another black marker, and I pulled that black marker out, and that black marker was weak. I then saw that there was a brown marker. And I said, let me try the brown marker. And I don't know if you can see this, but there's sort of like brown smear up here now. So that it's a really good marker. But now I apparently don't have a good enough eraser for it. So that's where we are. But anyway, um, yesterday was the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Who has been to Washington, D.C. to actually see the Declaration? Anybody? A few of you have. Um, how about Henry will take care of that, Al. Henry is dependable. He is like clockwork. Um, I'm setting a high expectation, Henry. I don't know what you're supposed to do with that. But who's been to Philadelphia to see like the Liberty Bell? I was in Philadelphia. We were doing a program for new graduate students, and we're in downtown. I said Independence Hall has to be around here somewhere, and they said, yeah, it's a few blocks that way, and I was not able to get to it, and I ended up being back in Philadelphia a few years later, and it turns out the hotel that I was staying at was on the same block with the grave of Benjamin Franklin, and I didn't even realize it. I knew that the Liberty Bell was nearby, and I went to see the Liberty Bell, and I crossed the street, and as I had crossed the street, I realized, oh, here's Independence Hall, right? It was quite by accident that I found myself on those grounds. But it's an interesting time, right? We think back and we think of that time of the Declaration, and I don't know how organized that time is in your head, and so I want to. And I say that because I know it's not organized in my head. So I'm going to give you a couple of things. We have the Declaration, right? Back around that time, there were some other things that went on that are notable in history. One of which is the Boston Tea Party. Who's heard of that? Who's been to Boston Harbor? Anybody been there? So we have the Tea Party. Um, there was there was the event. There was the battles of Lexington and Concord. In history, we record that as the shot heard round the world. And then I was also thinking that there was an event in that general time frame that is known as the Boston Massacre. Anybody remember that? Um, Now I'm putting these all on the board because shortly after I started teaching a Bible class, one of the things that I was convicted about was how do I help people become more literate biblically? Pastor Kent's in the back. I remember him sharing one Sunday morning. He said 2 generations ago, people knew what was in the Bible and knew where to find it. A generation ago, people knew what was in the Bible, but they didn't know where to find it. And then today, people don't know what's in there and they don't know where to find it. And I found that described me pretty accurately. So I decided that I would change that. And so I set about to become more literate, and I took some of you along that path with me to become more biblically literate because I didn't know who came first. I didn't know where Elijah was relative to David, relative to Paul. I didn't know that. I knew they were in here. That was the extent. I didn't understand that context. So we can know these things. But like, what's the context of these items? Which one happened first? Anyone want to take a guess? Should I look at our young students in here? Where are our history students in here? Tea Party. Tea Party took place. I have dates for this. 1216, December 16, 1773. It is not the first. It's not the first. There was something. Shot were heard round the world. Now I have that one. That one is April. I forgot since I turned around. April 19th, 1775. When's the Declaration? July 4, 1776. When was the Boston Massacre? It's the oldest one on here. It is, Boston Massacre was March 5th, 1770. So I share these because we recognize that the Boston Massacre happened before the Tea Party, and then from the Tea Party we end up with a shot heard around the world, and eventually we get to this point of July 4, 1776, which is what we celebrated 250 years of yesterday. Right? We had these things already. And what I share this with you, and of all the different wars that are part of our history, I know there's some people who are very fascinated with World War II. There's people who are fascinated with the Civil War. This is probably the period of history that interests me the most, although I don't know that I know it all that well. Right? So I'm not going to win any Jeopardy contest with this. But what I want to tell you is that for the longest time, I thought the Declaration of Independence is what started the Revolutionary War. That's what I would have said. I would have said, well, that's when it started. But I think if we look at some of these things, we can say that the war actually started much before that. And I see some people shaking their heads because there's people in here who are better history students than me. You're better history students than me. Yet, when we get to July 4, the war has already started, but we have this special place for the 4th of July. And I think it's because on that day, there's much more to the story, right? July 4th is the day that the colonies announced that they were breaking ties with the crown. And while we declare independence on that day, and that's what we celebrate, were we truly independent at that time? I don't. Perhaps we were in our mind, but there was still a lot of war to fight. There was a lot of war. There was going to be this ongoing conflict. There was going to be battles that were going to be fought, and many of those battles that were fought were lost. Some of them were won. Risks were going to be taken. Betrayals would happen throughout the conflict. And each challenge and each conflict that was faced was also overcome. I think you can look back and you can find the word miracle describing many of the events of those days. And you see, the fighting would ultimately continue until the Battle of Yorktown, which concluded, where's my date here? October 19, 1781. Now, at the Battle of Yorktown, that's when the British surrendered, effectively ending the war. Now, whenever I was in elementary school, and we first studied the Revolutionary War whenever I was in fifth grade, there would be, I remember my teacher was Mrs. McCartney, and she would have different things on the wall, and some of them would say Revolutionary War 1776 to 1781. But every once in a while, I would come across a sign that said Revolutionary War 1776 to 1783. And there's a reason for that, and it's because the Treaty of Paris, so the conflict effectively stopped on October 19th, but the Treaty of Paris, which formalized the end, was not signed, where'd that date go, till September 3rd, 1783, almost 2 years after the last battle. Now, even then, when the treaty is signed, we have a newly recognized country on planet Earth. And while that country was independent, it was still super fragile. It was super fragile. Now, in my household, somehow my kids started watching this musical called Hamilton. Has anybody heard of that? Has anybody seen that? Okay, I have not. But my understanding is that Alexander Hamilton was a prominent figure in those days. And what we have is, after we have independence, we started to get this national government. The first national government was under something called the Articles of the Confederation, and it did not work. It did not work. We didn't actually get to the U.S. Constitution that we have until 1788. So I give you that as a bit of a history lesson. And while the Declaration was made in 1776, I don't know that we can say that we were independent yet. But I do think there's something that piece of history can absolutely teach us about our identities. I think we can look at that story, and what we have here is we have a nation that changes its identity. It goes from being subjects of the crown to being an independent country. And I want to give you, I share with you these frameworks, and I don't know if you, I'm doing this exercise this week, and as I'm going through this exercise, what I've learned about myself is that I really like frameworks, that I really like having something to try to put handles on it to hold on to. And so I'm going to erase this. You can look, if you need those dates, they're all in the history books. But I'm going to give you a framework that I want you to consider today. The country declared a new identity before they realized that identity. That's perhaps one of the things that we can take from this. And so the framework that I would give you is that there was a declaration, and after that declaration, there was conflict. There was lots of conflict. That conflict gave the opportunity for growth. And then ultimately, we get to the point of victory. We get to that identity being realized. Okay, so I share that with you. Perhaps you can follow some of those historical events and see that order come from that. there's a lot of people on planet Earth that still get confused. Now, I've shared some different frameworks with you in previous weeks. I'm going to share a slightly different one here today. Sometimes we think that we have to have a victory to have our identity. That we need to have something. And from that, we may grow. As we do that, perhaps we would have some good behavior that comes from that. And then ultimately, that would be accepted. Couple of things here. There's times where we think that we have to find something that we are good at. When the colonies declared independence, you know what they were not good at? Independence. They weren't good at it yet. And because that they had to go through this period of conflict and growth. They had to go through this discomfort that exists. There's a lot of people that just say, well, this is something that I'm good at. Question for you. How many of you are good at being bad? Raise them. Be honest with me. How many of you are good at being bad? Jumping jacks, like both feet up. We're good at being bad. And if we take that, sometimes we could say, well, how do we get better at it? Some people go down that path about being better at being bad, good, worse at being. I don't know what I didn't work that part of the lesson out. But just understand, like there's some part of it where there's some things that happen, and you say, oh well, I'll grow from that. We ultimately get to where there's this prevailing behavior that we present. There's a prevailing, and I'm calling that good. Let me put that in quotes. I'm going to need a new marker. That's what I'm going to need. That we may have this good behavior. Just out of curiosity, besides me, does anybody else struggle with behaving good? Yeah, every day. Every day. You see, there's a lot of folks, especially believers, who think that I'm a believer, so that's victory, and then they don't do a whole lot to grow. A phrase that I will give you is nothing fails like success. Nothing fails like success, right? So I'm a basketball fan. I like watching the teams play. What you rarely see is the same team win year after year after year after year after year, at least win the championship. Right? They may be competitive, they may do well, but you don't always see that. It's a bit of a rarity, which is why those teams are celebrated. That's why they're recognized. And it's because whenever things are going well for you, you know what you don't think you need to do? You don't think you need to get better. And then you try to just have the right behaviors. And sometimes you go through the motions. And you think, maybe I'll be accepted. I was wondering if Christians believe this. And I was thinking about when I was much, much younger, that, well, hey, I'm a Christian, I have a name, but I wasn't doing a whole lot to grow. I was trying to present the right behaviors. I now present some pretty questionable behaviors. A lot of those questionable behaviors I do are to try to make sure I connect with people and that I meet them where they are. Because I recognize that there's a greater value in connecting to lost people. I didn't know that for a long. Oh, thank you.
I'm out of breath. I'm like, where's my class?
Thank you so much, Sharon. I thought I offended you again. So, so, but like, there's and maybe who grew up in the church, and like we were trained with sort of the behaviors that we were supposed to present. And maybe we had somebody catch us not doing one of those behaviors or multiple of those behaviors. Don't raise your hands. That's all of us. Right? And shame. Shame on you for not doing that. And then what happens is we get to this point where, oh my goodness, maybe God's not happy with me. Maybe He's not accepting me. That's the way my young mind, my immature mind worked. There's many other faiths and religions on planet Earth. And they actually promote that if you do your best, maybe, just maybe, their higher power will see you and accept you. Now, I had heard of that. I lived in Cochranton. I didn't see that. There were a group of people who claimed to be believers. There were some people who were pretty obviously non-believers. That's what it was. When I go to the University of Pittsburgh, I find myself in the library one night. It was in Scaife Hall, the health systems library, down in the dungeon of the basement. And there was one way I could go to the restroom, and when I came out, there was a doorway. It must have been an emergency exit. I don't know that I ever saw anybody go in or out of that. But I remember walking by, and I looked, and there was a Muslim guy on a prayer mat, praying in the middle of the library. Now, I had heard of things like this before. I ain't never seen it before. Now, the reason, as I understand it, is that in that faith, what they do is they have this belief that you need to face Mecca and that you need to pray 5 times a day, however many times a day. Now, the thing is that if you miss, somebody else is going to take your place. It's competitive. How do you get the attention? How do you gain favor? And it's that you got to outperform somebody, right? And I'm suspicious that there's many Christians that maybe not explicitly, somehow they think the same way. They think that if they read their Bible a certain amount, or if they pray a certain number of times a day, that somehow they'll be considered to be a good Christian. Or maybe there's some other things that we can do. And if we don't do them, sometimes there's people who are quick to discount the value of our faith. They're quick to discount what our salvation really looks like. And I can recognize this is getting uncomfortable because fewer people are making eye contact with me. This is a one time. Like, one time I'm going to do this actual lesson, right? You know, maybe you've had somebody say, oh, believer wouldn't dress like that. Whew, I thought they were a believer, but no, not. Maybe there's certain things that they've said. Maybe there's foods that they eat. Maybe you understand that they watch certain television shows or they've seen certain movies. Maybe they make a joke that you think just that's not a joke that a Christian would make. It's certainly not a joke that a Christian would laugh at. Or maybe this person has a vice like smoking or drinking. And this one was specifically for my wife. She's not here today, but it's in the script, so I'll share it with you. not responding to text messages, which is apparently something that I don't do to her satisfaction. Right? You know, it's this thought process, and you know that this thought process exists in the world. I'm not saying you have to agree with it. I just want you to be aware that it's out there. That it's this thought process based on real examples. Right? You can think of somebody who maybe dresses in a way that maybe they said something or they behave like that's what it is. It fuels so many of the common negative Christian stereotypes in the world. I was in grade school and I was doing a sleepover at I was doing a sleepover at a friend's house, which I would never do again because they camped outside and it was cold. And I'm soft. I was soft back then. I'm softer now. It was a rough time. It was a rough time. But there was a brother and sister, and so I was on the brother side. There was a group that were camping in one tent. The sister had to camp out, and there were some girls. They were in a different tent, the other side of the house. And as would be typical, boys thought it would be a good idea to go scare the girls in the dark. Now, to the wisdom of the parents, they knew better than to have everybody in the house. And I'm going to use the actual language. And it was questionable for that time. You're a mature group. You'll probably laugh, but I'm just going to give that warning. So I'm part of the group of boys, and we're sneaking up on the girls' tent. And we're getting close, and we're trying to be quiet. And we're listening, and we can hear the girls talking, and one of the girls uses the word pervert, of which one of the other girls quickly said, "I thought you were a Christian." And that was because that's a word obviously that Christian wouldn't use, right? At least that was the thinking of however old we were at the time, 10, 11, 12 years old. But even as kids have this flawed thought process, this flawed programming, and it carries over. It carries over. The gospel itself tells us that, thank you, Sharon. Thank you. Wow, is that beautiful? Thank you. There you go. There you go. Wow. I'm about ready to start scratching it in with my fingernail. But this is the way that works. This is identity based on the gospel. God declares, He says, this is who you are. And when you know who you are, you know what you're going to encounter? Conflict. It's coming. It's coming. And as you encounter that conflict, and it looks so many different ways for us. The conflict I face is probably completely different than the conflict you face. And I'll tell you this, is that we wouldn't trade. We wouldn't trade conflicts. But that conflict gives us the opportunity and the invitation to grow. There's the opportunity, there's the invitation to grow and develop. And for your notes, we must grow. That's why we have that as a core value in this group. We've got to grow. We must develop. And the big idea that I would share with you today is that God's declaration about who you are comes before your full experience of becoming that person. It comes before. Think about this. David. God declares that David would be king. David is currently operating under the identity of shepherd. He has not fought Goliath yet. Now, we know that God knew all about David before even that happened, right? We knew that God formed David and he said, you know what? He's going to be a shepherd and a poet and a musician and a warrior and a giant slayer and a king. Like he had prescribed all that for David. David didn't know that yet. He didn't know it yet. At that point, he had maybe some poet, maybe some musician, some shepherding, but the other stuff, that wasn't there yet. God declares. David had to go through conflict. He had to go through growth. He had to go through development before being a king was his reality. And I want you to know that the same holds true for you and me. God has declared things about each of us that we have to go through conflict and growth and development before we realize. Paul wrote about this extensively. I have two passages. I don't know that we're going to get. These are the four passages that I would give you on Paul talking about this framework. All right, you can take this framework, you can find it in these passages. We're going to go through Romans. We might get through Ephesians. We might. I've starred these two. Those are your assignments. Take them home. Look for it. Because when you look at Paul's writing, again, Paul's writing inspired by the Holy Spirit, he's finding the things that God has declared and he is putting that out there for us. So if you would, I'm going to read from Romans chapter 8, verses 14 through 17. Paul writes, "For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God." Declaration. Brother and sister, you are a child of God. That has been declared. Verse 15, "The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear. Again, rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship." Declaration. You're claimed. God claims you. And we cry, and by him we cry, "Abba, Father." The Spirit testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Those are declarations. There is nothing in here so far about your behavior, the jokes that you make, the jokes that you laugh at, the foods that, like all that stuff, it ain't there. This is what is being declared. Verse 17, "Now if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings." What does he tell you that's going to come? Conflict. Anyone in conflict today? Conflict's coming. If indeed we share in his sufferings, in that conflict, in order that we may also share in his glory. That's victory. The step between conflict and victory is the growth. Paul doesn't say, behave like sons so that one day God's going to adopt you. Paul says, you are a son, live that way. I like to come up with different phrases or principles. Perhaps I would call this the Declaration of Independence principle, just in honor of the weekend. But the principle that we're looking, we'll call it the Declaration principle. And the definition that I would give you is that identity precedes experience. Three things I want you to know. Number one, God declares before we develop. God declares your identity before you develop. I have 4 examples here. Abraham. What did God say to Abraham? God said, I will make you a great nation. Declaration. What offspring did Abraham have at the time? None. Before the experience, it was declared. God says to Moses, you need to go to Pharaoh. Get the people out of here. It was declared before that experience happened. And that process of the people being freed from slavery in Egypt, I would call that conflict. I would call that growth before they experienced the victory of leaving. They would have other conflicts as soon as they left, but we'll save that for another study, right? Again, David was anointed king years before he would become king. We looked at this a few weeks ago. Jesus at the baptism, God says, "This is my beloved Son," before Jesus had performed any miracle. And I want you to know that the same is true for us. These stories are recorded to encourage us, to give us those perspectives. We are declared God's children before we are sanctified. Now, there's probably a whole separate lesson that we could do on that. But sanctification is the process of becoming more and more like Jesus. So, number one, God declares our identity before we develop. Number two, we often measure ourselves by experience. We measure ourselves by experience. You know, I suspect some of us in here have thought, I'm not where I should be right now. Anybody been dissatisfied with where they are in life? So how many of you are dissatisfied with where you are in life right now? That's part of it. We may think to ourselves, I should know more, I should do more. I'm still struggling with this. Why am I still struggling with this? It's been a while. I'm going to blame Sean just because he's an easy target, and I try to avoid responsibility as much as possible. But I've shared this story, and it's been a while since I've shared it with here, but I shared it recently with someone, so I'm going to share it again here. I grew up in the church. I cannot remember a time when Sunday was not a call to go to church. I knew most of the Bible stories. I didn't know how they went together, but you could say, hey, tell me the story about Jesus walking on the water. And I could tell you the story about Jesus walking on the water. Tell me the story about Jonah and the whale. I could tell you the story about Jonah and the whale. Tell me the story about David and Goliath. I could tell you the story about David and Goliath. I didn't understand how they all blended. I didn't understand how they were connected, but I knew them. And I found myself in my early 30s. And I was driving home from Punxsutawney one night. I was on the far side of the Cranberry Mall when the Cranberry Mall had tenants. It's been a while. It's been a while. And I was listening to something on the radio, and it was said, how sad is it that someone has been in church their whole life, but spiritually they're still in adolescence? And as somebody in his 30s, I thought, wow, that describes me a little too closely. And that was my conflict. That was my conflict. You see, the enemy had me tied up in busyness. I just kept going and going and going. There was always something to do. It was easy to get distracted. I could go back, I could find one of my work calendars where I worked 46 out of 52 weekends one year. It was easy to be away. Easy. And so I set out to grow. And as I started to grow, it was a really wonderful thing. And then I got this crazy idea. I'm like, you know what? Maybe I'll start my own class. Because I wanted to teach the class. The class that I wanted to go to didn't exist. Not here. And so I decided I was going to teach the class that I wanted to attend. Which, I mean, what level of insanity is that? Like, what type of maniac does something like that? And there were a few people that showed up. And in their encouragement, they would leave those early classes and they would tell me, your grandmother was a really good Sunday school teacher. And they would tell me that because I was obviously not. I was obviously not. That's true. Those words were meant to encourage me. I thought there might be a couple people in here that would go back 20 years with me. As I look around, I don't think there are. Not, at least not today. But that's where I started the journey. There, a few of those people had to be there. Trace had to be there. Like, she didn't really have a choice in it. But for those of you who have been with me for a long time, I trust you can see that I have grown and I have developed a little bit over the years. I hope you can see that. And you would know this, it wasn't smooth. It's never smooth. I really debated on this note. I wrote, growth is rarely smooth, and I wanted to say growth is never smooth. But I thought maybe some of you are just really good at growing and I don't know it. And if that's the case, if you're really good at it, you need to teach a lesson. This is my invitation to you, because I have found that growth is rarely smooth. But that lack of smoothness does not dispute your identity. It does not negate what God has said about you. Think of a child, an infant, learning to walk, right? I don't even know what the relation is. I have a cousin, or I have a niece who has a kid. I don't know what that makes me. I think of that scene in Spaceballs where he says, I'm your cousin's roommate's nephew's brother's cousin or whatever, and he says, what's that make us? And the joke is absolutely nothing. I don't, like that's kind of, I don't get worked up with that stuff. But he's a little more than a year old and he's starting to walk. And as kids start to learn how to walk, what do? They fall. It's not smooth. It's not smooth. How many times do you let a kid fall before how many of you had kids, or let me ask, how many of you knew kids that weren't quite as good as your kids? Yeah. And you watch these other people's kids get up and fall down, and like you thought, well, come on, just give up. Your kid's not going to be able to walk. Just tell them to quit. Just tell them to quit. We don't do that. You get up. You do it again. You do it again. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm 50 years old. I still fall. Literally. Easter Sunday, we're having dinner at my mother's house. My mother calls. She says, Jess, I need a table brought up into the dining room, which I have learned means now. I need a table brought up to the dining room now. So I go, I get said table. I take it up the steps into the dining room. I'm about to set it up, and she says, oh, I'm not ready for it yet. I said, well, do you want me to leave it here, or would you like me to take it back downstairs? She said, take it back downstairs. I was taking the table down the stairs, and I fell. I'm 50 years old. How many times do you have to? Now, in my defense, steps are trickier than just regular steps, right? Stairs are different than steps, right? Fortunately, I had the table to hold on to, so I didn't have a horrific crash, but I missed the step. Failures do not negate your identity. You don't screw up so many times and God says, I guess I missed the mark on that one. Doesn't happen. Keep going. Point number 3. Identity creates direction. Identity creates direction. We started off with a history lesson, which I should not have erased because I should go back and point it. I'm not going to rewrite it because we're short on time. But what I want to call out from those moments from all those years ago is that we didn't wait to declare independence until after we had won. We declared independence before, right? Because the declaration gave us a direction. And it gave us a reason to continue on. It gave us a reason to persevere. I have a whole little lesson about persevere versus persist, but the word persevere, right in the middle of it, in the heart of the word persevere is the word severe. Right? Severe. Conflict. You have direction and you're going to have to persevere. You're going to go through conflict. As believers, we do not fight that we are children of God. We need to fight that we don't need to fight to become a child of God. We need to fight from being a child of God. Recognize your identity. We have that direction. And we know that when we have that, we're going to face challenge and adversity as we move forward. Last week, I'm going to get kicked out of here. I gave you a filter that said, or I gave you a framework that said feel. We talked about how our feelings often betray us, so we have to filter them to see what God says about it. And from that, we're supposed to take action, right? We're supposed to follow. That was the framework I gave you last week. This week, I'm going to give you a slightly different one. And I think it's one that actually complements this one. But recognize what God declares. And from that, we need to discover what He said about us. Because how many of you know all the things that God has said about you? We don't. It's a bit of an adventure. You discover these things along the way. We discover. We develop. And then we display. We show off what God made us to do. Right? Those. I share this with you not as a competing, but as a complementing framework. In the interest of time, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you that Paul did right about this declaration principle, as I've called it. If you go to Ephesians chapter 1, I want you to recognize you just have to get to verse 3 to start finding Paul talking about what God has declared about you. And so I want to invite you to underline every statement from verses 3 to 14 where Paul tells you about something that God says you are. This is something that God says you are. When you get to the rest of Ephesians, you're going to get instruction on what you're supposed to do. But Paul starts out and he says, this is who you are. And then he gets to, this is what you do. This is how you develop it. Right? It's not the other way around. I want you to imagine the year 1778, and they're in the middle of this Revolutionary War, and there's some people sitting around the table, and they say, you know what? I don't feel very independent right now. Someone around the table probably would reply, whether you feel independent or not, know what the Declaration has already said about you. Right? Know what that is. So today, whether you feel worthy today, whether you feel forgiven today, whether you feel loved today, whether you feel useful today, what I want to encourage you with is that God has already declared things about you. He has already declared those things. And maybe you don't feel that way, but remember, the declaration comes before the transformation happens. I have the privilege of having a couple of young folks in the class today. And I want to give you this specific encouragement, very practical encouragement. The conflict and growth processes are very messy. This is where the adults in the room agree, and we encourage the young people. The conflict and the growth is messy. And there may be times when you're actually growing in the wrong direction. You may spend some time on the wrong path, and I can say that because I know I did. I mean, adults, how many of us have taken a detour or two in our life? Youngsters, check this out. Look at the hands. Taken a detour or two in life. We talked last week about how our emotions can often betray us, and I want you to know that sometimes those feelings that you're not where you're supposed to be, or this is a real mess, whatever, the truth may take time to catch up, but what I want you to know is that God's declarations over you is not waiting for your emotions. Your emotions will catch up. America spent years learning to live as the nation it had already declared itself to be. And the Christian life is very similar. We spend the rest of our lives learning to live as the sons and daughters of God, who has already declared us to be His through Christ. And my encouragement to you today is this, that we may all live our lives as God has declared them for us. That's where I'm going to stop today. I'm going to go over and stop the recording. I'm just going to ask that you stand where you are. I'll pray you out from here. I've gone way overboard.